GoPro Hero 8 Black is a great camera that's capable of delivering incredible footage. Now, in order to capture that incredible footage, there are some settings that I recommend. My goal with this video is to present the settings that will give you the best, highest quality, most cinematic footage from this camera. Now, a few of these settings will apply for general use of this camera. Other settings are going to apply for very specific use cases. Let's get started. First, there is one setting that you'll want to configure for any video mode in this camera. In order to configure this setting, you are going to swipe down and go to Preferences. Once you're at Preferences, you're going to select General. You will then select Video Compression. Under Video Compression, you will select HEVC. HEVC is a video codec that will give you the highest quality footage while also maintaining the file size. Next, we're going to go to Video Mode on the camera. Here is where we're going to customize all of these specific settings for several different use cases. Now, the great thing about this camera is you can now create your own presets and save them. And when you want to shoot a certain type of video, you can just toggle between the presets and select whichever mode you've already pre-configured. This is one of the biggest features I love about this camera. It makes it a lot easier to switch between different types of settings. For instance, you might have a setting where you're talking to the camera. You might have another setting where you're skiing or hiking or jumping into the water, where you want a different mode. I have configured 4 different presets. I am now going to go through each one and explain what it's for. First of all, we have the standard preset. The standard preset is the preset I have anytime I'm going to be vlogging or talking directly into the camera and want to have the audio maintained. Of the 4 modes, this is the only mode that I have set up for talking to the camera and keeping the audio. Since my end goal is 24 frames per second for the finished product, this particular mode will be in 24 frames per second. Once you're in video mode, you will see some options along the bottom here. Now, mine right now says standard 4K 24L. We're going to click on that. When I click on that, you see several of my options here. You see standard, activity, slow-mo, and cinematic. We're going to click on the edit button right here to the right of the mode. When you do that, it's going to bring up several settings. Now, for my standard mode, I have all of my settings configured here for you to view. The first setting is the resolution in frames per second. In order to set any of these, you simply click on them. So in my case, I have it set at 4K 24. The other options that are available under the resolution are highlighted in white. And then the actual resolution options up here at the top are also highlighted in white. Now in 4K, you can only go up to 60 frames per second, so you do not see the 120 or the 240 available under this mode. For the lens, I have it set to linear. Now, the neat thing about this GoPro is in order to set different types of lenses, it's now called digital lens, and you can actually toggle between the different options here. So in this particular mode, you have super view, you have wide, and then you have linear. Now, linear is the mode I have for this because when people are talking to the camera, you do not want the fisheye effect that wide or super wide can give. Hypersmooth is on. In fact, it is Hypersmooth 2.0. Now, in this mode, I could go to a high mode, which would crop the video by 10%, or I could go to boost. Now, boost I would recommend if you're talking to the camera while running or doing something where there's a lot of shaking. It will really stabilize that video. But for me, when I'm talking to the camera, I'm not really running or doing anything fast, so I stick with Hypersmooth 2.0. But that's easy enough to adjust when you're within the mode. When you scroll down here, I have low light set to NA, zoom is set to 1.0x, clips is turned off. The next set of options you're going to see is Pro Tune. Definitely make sure Pro Tune is turned on. And for the bitrate, we want to select high. Now, the high bitrate on here will give you the 100 megabits per second, which is new to the GoPro Hero 8 Black. Previously, you could only go up to about 78 megabits per second. This higher bitrate gives you a lot higher quality footage. Shutter speed, I have that set to auto. EV comp, I have set to 0. White balance is set to 5500K. Now, 5500K is going to be ideal on a day where it's mostly sunny out, with sun and maybe a little bit of clouds. Anything that's like toward the middle of the day or any time when there's a good bit of light. If you click on the white balance. So for me, I keep it right around 5500K because most of the time when I'm shooting outside, it's going to be on a pretty sunny day. Now the good news is even if you had your white balance off slightly, like let's say you had it on 5500K and it was cloudier out, it is easier to fix it later versus if you were to leave it on auto. If you leave white balance on auto, if you're going in and out of woods or shadows or anything like that, it can really mess up the video because the white balance is going to be switching on you. But if you keep it at one consistent white balance, it's much easier to fix when you're editing later on. ISO minimum I have at 100, ISO max I have at 400. Having it set at 400 for the max is key because if it's any higher than that, you're going to start to see grain and noise in your footage and it's not going to look smooth and crisp. So I definitely don't recommend going higher than 400 for the ISO. Scrolling down further, sharpness I have low. The reason I have sharpness at low is when you edit later on, you can always add sharpness back to it, but it's very hard to take sharpness away. Color I have set to flat. I select flat because that's a neutral color profile. So when you're editing later on, there might be certain colors you want to bring out a little more in post-production than others. And when you have it set to flat, it's much easier to control the level of saturation and certain colors that you have in your video. And for this particular one, I have raw audio set to low, and then I have wind turned off. I find that if I have raw audio set to high and wind turned on, that it can often make the audio fluctuate in the video. Let's say you're on a day where there's gusts of wind, then the wind lets up a little, or if you're by the ocean and there's waves coming in, that can really mess with the sound. So I put the raw audio to low and the wind is off, and I get much more consistent audio that way. The next set of options are the on-screen shortcuts. These I keep at defaults. And then at the bottom is the option to restore. If you ever decide to set these settings back to their factory defaults, that would be the button you hit for this preset. All right, let's go on to the next mode. The second mode is activity mode. Activity mode is my preset for any type of motion that I would like to slow down to slightly less than half speed. In other words, this will be footage that does not include super rapid motion. This is a very specific type of effect that you will see used often, and this preset will be very useful for that. Check out these examples. You can see these settings there are 4K, 60 frames per second, and wide. So you'll click the edit button there. Now with activity, I do have it set to 4K 60, and the lens is wide. I would set it to linear, so I wouldn't have the fisheye effect, because I'm not a fan of the fisheye in this particular mode. However, if you set it to linear on this mode, you will notice that it changes this back to 4K 30 frames per second. The reason is that linear is not currently available with Hypersmooth at 60 frames per second. Unfortunately, in 4K, you can only go up to 30 frames per second with linear and with Hypersmooth. If you go up to 60 frames per second, you cannot have linear and Hypersmooth 2.0. You would have to choose either to have wide with Hypersmooth or linear without any Hypersmooth. So Hypersmooth is very important to me, so I keep this at 60 frames per second, and then the lens goes back to wide and Hypersmooth is turned on. In other words, I would rather have smooth video with a little bit of fisheye distortion on the edges than I would have linear without that stabilization. Without stabilization, the video is going to be quite shaky. So all of the rest of the settings are the same as the first standard mode. The bitrate of high, shutter of auto, EV comp 0, white balance 5500K, ISO minimum at 100, and ISO max at 400. Now with this one, the audio settings I haven't changed because I'm not going to ever be using any audio from this mode. This is simply going to be video. The third mode will be slow-mo. Slow-mo is my preset for footage that I would like to slow down to 1/5 of the original speed. This is great for any type of fast motion, any type of action where you're riding along and you want to slow it down. Like if you're doing a jump while skiing, you're jumping into the water and you want to slow down midair. If you're doing a jump with a snowmobile, if somebody's running and you want to slow it down, the possibilities are endless. Check out some examples. Now this is the only mode that I shoot in 2.7K, and the reason is that you cannot do 4K at 120 frames per second. 120 frames per second is only available as high as 2.7K. However, when I have exported finished products, sometimes I have brought the 2.7K footage up to 4K. Because it is such high quality, if you mix it in with 4K footage, generally you're not going to be able to tell. The other option is you can bring 4K footage down to 2.7K, or you can export the finished product that has a mix of these as 1080p, and that also will look great. So for the slow-mo settings, I'm gonna click here. So I have it set to the 2.7K with the 120 frames per second. The lens is set to wide. That is the only option available with that configuration. Hypersmooth is on, which is awesome. Getting 2.7K video at 120 frames per second with stabilization is incredible. The rest of the settings are going to be the same as I have on the other modes. Once again, the audio settings, I don't care about those. I'm not using any audio from this. And then all of the rest of these are the defaults. And finally, the fourth mode that I have is cinematic. Now, cinematic is the mode that will be for any footage where I or others won't be talking to the camera for the purpose of having the audio, but it'll be footage where I want it slowed down just slightly. And by slightly, I mean by about 20%. So the end footage would be about 80% of the original speed. This can give the footage a slightly dreamy effect without it being slow-mo. So as I mentioned earlier, the cinematic mode is going to be the mode where I want to slow down the footage slightly by approximately 20%. So the finished product is going to be 80% of the initial speed that I shot it in. And as you can see, the lens is set to linear, Hypersmooth is set to high. The reason I have Hypersmooth set to high here is because I tend to have a little bit more motion when I'm doing 4K 30 frames per second shooting. You certainly can't go wrong having Hypersmooth set to 2.0, but I usually use high on this and sometimes boost if I'm running. All of these settings are the same as the other modes, and once again with this one I don't care about the audio because I'm not going to be using any audio from it. Well, there you have it, folks. Those are the 4 modes and all of the settings that I configure for those. Try them out. I think you will be thrilled with the footage you get. If you have any questions or want any recommendations on how to get the best out of this camera, please leave them in the comments below, and we will promptly get back to you. If you found this video to be useful, please consider subscribing and liking.